Привет, добро пожаловать на мой канал. Сегодня мы слушаем. So guys, today we have Soviet punk and new wave in the 1980s, a pivotal decade, history of Soviet rock part 2. So I essentially saw part 1 and I figured, you know what? Part 2 it's a whole different thing. It's the 80s era. So I figured I'd make a reaction to it. Sorry guys, no Russian translations. Get to it.
In the early 1980s Soviet Union, deep in the countryside by the Ural Mountains, two kids in their early 20s would experiment with tape loops, drum machines, and sequencers. How they came across this equipment was certainly an unlikely story, given they lived in one of Russia's top secret nuclear towns. Chelyabinsk 70, as it was known at the time, was one of the principal design centers for Soviet nuclear weapons. Living there was like living on a top-secret military base. The city didn't even appear on maps. These two kids called themselves This, which translates to Vova Blue and the Brothers of the Mind. They would release home-recorded tapes of eerie, dancey, industrial punk rock, inspired by the best of the underground in Russia, Europe, and America, yet truly coming from the underground. In the 80s, punk rock was only semi-legal in the Soviet Union. Bands were not allowed to make money from performing or selling music, but even so, the decade was a time when rock, punk, new wave, and dance music was becoming a serious phenomenon, spreading in underground dance clubs and apartment venues. Brothers of the Mind would release several cassettes that would spread from one tape copier to another all across the Eastern Bloc. Eventually relocating to Moscow, they'd become something of underground celebrities, even playing a show with Sonic Youth. Their YouTube videos today, which are super fantastic by the way, are full of comments from people saying they heard Vova Blue on some cassette decades ago and weren't sure if they'd ever find them again.
Hey, should I get some electronic music on the channel?
Many Soviet bands followed over the course of the decade, beginning in isolated pockets, moving to cities, and growing in popularity, but not sure if they'd ever truly be allowed a career in music, or if their recordings would even survive to the next generation. The story of Soviet punk and new wave begins in the city of Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg. In 1981, a group of bands came together to form the Leningrad Rock Club, the first ever rock music venue in the entire Soviet Union. Well, sort of. Since the late 60s, bands had been trying to build a music scene, putting on occasional festivals and underground shows, but it was always an uphill battle. At best, rock music was seen as an idiotic but harmless fad. At worst, it was seen as ideologically evil and something that needed to be stamped out.
No way.
But in 1980, the mood was shifting. The Tbilisi Festival had softened the authorities' stance on live music, and with the Moscow Olympics that summer, there was an atmosphere of cultural exchange and international goodwill. Well, not with the United States, since they boycotted the games. But nevertheless, radio stations and journalists were allowed to cover the country's rock scene for the first time. And members of the band Aquarium, along with other musicians, took advantage by drafting a proposal for the Leningrad Rock Club. This was no simple task. The proposal laid out in excruciating detail exactly how the rock club would function. Bands would audition before a council in order to earn membership, which gave them the ability to perform. The council did all the booking, press, and promotion, but a handful of curators at the top would have to sign off on all decisions, including which songs bands were even allowed to perform. Yes, literally, you had to bring 6 typewritten copies of all your songs' lyrics to be reviewed and debated by the censors.
What?
The Russian film Leto, which takes place during this era, portrays a meeting where the band Kino pleaded their case.
Распущенность. Половую.
Through the rock club's president, the Ministry of Culture and KGB would also get a back door into the city's subversive elements. Everybody knew there were informants around, but it was seen as simply a compromise to give their music scene a legitimate home base. Some of the first bands to play at the Rock Club were Aquarium and Mike Nemenko. As two of the pioneers of what would be considered Soviet punk, it might be surprising to hear how laid back the music was. There's a strong influence from the Velvet Underground and T-Rex. Journalist Artemy Troitsky would point out that this comes from Russia's literary tradition. Bands tended to emphasize lyrics and prose over raw energy. But it also makes sense given the restrictions on the audience. As musician Fedor Lavrov told, disguised KGB agents would go up and down the rows, asking the audience not to jump and not to dance. Those who were unable to control their emotions would be taken out under arrest. Usually by the end of the concert, the crowd went crazy. The first rows jumped up on the chairs, and the police were unable to catch everyone. Wet and exhausted but totally happy, attendees went out in the street where a police bus, already almost filled, waited with the arrested hooligans. But to be clear, it wasn't all acoustic shows either. The band,
That's
the
crazy,
Russians,
bro.
were
They were
another
trying to
early
stop
favorite,
human
playing heavy psych rock
emotions.
a la Deep Purple. By the second year of the Rock Club, alternative, dance, and new wave bands would emerge too. Kino and Strange Games being two of the early favorites. Officially, the club was only meant to be a way for amateur bands and their audiences to blow off some steam after work. The bands were still not allowed to earn money from performances, and there was certainly no merch table to sell tapes after the show. To become an official band, one that was allowed to make money from selling records, you had to pass a litany of bureaucratic hurdles. The Ministry of Culture was extremely selective about who they gave that
So happy I
privilege to,
recognize some
and
of these
anybody
songs.
too noisy or too gloomy wouldn't stand a chance. But many bands preferred the freedom they got from being unofficial. It gave them authenticity, and listeners recognized that. Within just a few years, there was a vast network of music fans trading home-recorded cassettes, and bands that barely ever made a few rubles playing music were becoming underground celebrities. From Moscow was Center, a post-punk band that sounded somewhat like Gain of Four, but in their own groovy Russian way. Also emerging from Moscow was Spooky Moo, a truly out-of-this-world band that takes Nick Cave's stage presence to a whole new dimension. From Siberia was Grazdanskaya Oborona, Russian for civil defense, but often called GROB for short.
Yep, civil defense,
Fronted by
boy.
Yegor Latov, their music sounds aching and personal, sometimes uncomfortably so. It reminds me of American emo music, though years ahead of its time.
There you go. Wow. That's a weird way to put it.
From Uzbekistan was Original, a new wave band that easily sounds like they belong in the 2020s, with their hushed vocals and retro sequencer.
What?
Original was one of the few good bands that managed to release music through the official Soviet record label, Melodia, thus making them an official band. But unfortunately, this did not make the road ahead any easier. At the end of 1982, Leonid Brezhnev, the man who had been leading the Soviet Union for 18 years, had fallen ill and died. New leadership took over, and with them came a brand new cultural agenda. The growth of rock music and dance clubs was no longer seen as a harmless peculiarity. Instead, it was a sign of societal illness, that the country's youth were losing touch with Soviet ideology, and to restore their faith in communism, they had to be fixed. Their first target was the publications. Critical op-eds about the rock genre began to appear, and soon features about bands and upcoming shows were no longer allowed to be published. Then it was the official bands. A new law required that 80% of their music had to be written by the Union of Composers, the government songwriting union who composed operas, film scores, and jingles. It was a blatant attempt to kill the creativity and momentum of the
They
scene.
really tried to
Or
kill
the
it?
power of an old conservative institution. Dozens of bands had effectively been canceled overnight. Many simply broke up and found day jobs. Others sought loopholes like scrapping together a few instrumental pieces written by the union members or reclassifying themselves as solo artists. But pretty soon all bands would be on the same boat. Homemade cassettes, the lifeblood of the underground scene, were suddenly banned. They weren't exactly
What?
outlawed, but radio stations and dance clubs were forbidden to play them. Those who did not follow the guidelines and continued supporting underground music, like journalist Artemy Troitsky, would find themselves in a Kafka-like nightmare. Work would slow down, colleagues would stop returning your calls. Eventually, somebody would tell you they'd been advised not to work with you. For musicians, the year 1984 in the Soviet Union would be a lot like 1984. Many bands split up or hid out in studios to record, or worse, would be arrested. The singer of
What?
Original was sentenced to 5 years in a Siberian labor camp for, quote, organizing events that are accompanied by the use of alcohol and drugs. The singer of The Russians, George Ordansky, would mysteriously disappear while vacationing with friends. Many suspected a KGB hit job, although no explanation was ever proven, nor was any trace of him ever found. And
Damn.
Igor Latov of GROB would find himself in the midst of a KGB investigation after the mother of one of his band members reported them. After
What?
the KGB stumbled on a suicide letter, Igor was committed to a mental institution.
No way.
I got enhanced support and received antipsychotics, he wrote. These are suppressive drugs that make a moron out of a person. The effect is similar to a lobotomy. A person becomes soft, complacent, and broken after the treatment. Like the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Dang.
I realized at some point that I had to create to not go crazy. I walked and composed all day. I wrote stories and poems. Every day, my manager came to me, and I gave him through the bars everything I wrote. But if the Kremlin's intention was to starve the subculture out of existence, it had the opposite effect. It brought people together. There may have been drastically fewer concerts, but tapes were suddenly everywhere. Bands who had previously taken the censorship in stride were becoming more outspoken.
Rzikin's current hit single is in distribution on cassette in the black market and is called Your Dad's a Fascist.
Televisor would form this year, and during their first appearance at the Leningrad Rock Club's annual festival, they caused a scandal for playing 2 songs that weren't approved by the censors, We Are Marching and Spinning Out of Control. Fortunately, the punishment was only a 6-month ban from the rock club, and not a trip to the Gulag. Owing to the fact that the rock club even still existed, Leningrad gained a reputation as being a bit more tolerant. This would attract many artists to the city in the coming years, including DDT. Like Televisor, DDT played music that was much angrier and more outspoken than was generally acceptable. And this had led to friction with the authorities in Ifa, their previous home out east.
What? Even DDT had problems with the government? Oh, that's...
In 1985, Gorbachev became the new general secretary, and it quickly became clear there was a new sheriff in town. Gorbachev was less conservative than his predecessors and immediately pushed an agenda towards modernizing the economy. For writers and musicians, it was reason for cautious optimism. The summer of that year saw the opening of the Moscow Rock Club in the same style as Leningrad's, as well as an enormous music and arts festival. Thousands of attendees came to Gorky Park to watch rock, new wave, reggae, and salsa bands play on an open-air stage. There was even an appearance from Bob Dylan in one of the first visits of an American performer to the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, his visit was a lot less influential than the music community had hoped. Dylan was given the red carpet experience and spent his trip hobnobbing with party elites. He did not slam vodka with Boris Grebenshchikov or any members of the rock scene.
To be expected, though.
Nevertheless, in the following year, Gorbachev's policies of perestroika and glasnost would start to take hold. Cultural restrictions eased, the press was allowed to speak more openly, and private enterprise began to creep up.
Hell yeah, man.
If this were a movie, perestroika would be the final act, when all the bands that had suffered through the shutdown re-emerged gloriously. Almost overnight, bands were allowed to release music commercially and tour the country. Variety shows like Musical Ring appeared, broadcasting the country's previously underground bands to millions of people. And one of the greatest Soviet punk performances of all time, Zvooky Moo takes the stage and simultaneously terrifies and amazes the audience.
Ooh, I gotta watch this. I have to watch this. Leave a link in the description. I mean, in the
After
comments.
all,
In the
they were
comments.
used to seeing stuff like this on broadcast TV.
Oh yeah, he's like the opposite of
Another
that.
legendary episode saw the band Auction from Leningrad give an insane performance, which ended with their band members stripping to a G-string and running into the crowd. A bold move in a country where homosexuality was still illegal.
Oh.
Rock and punk would play a pivotal role in Soviet cinema, which was suddenly allowed to explore previously taboo topics like drug abuse and corruption. In the 1987 film Asa, Victor Tsoi of Kino makes an appearance. While auditioning to perform at a restaurant,
gonna watch
he's
this.
told a long list of bureaucratic requirements he must fulfill. Tsoi simply walks out of the interview to join his band on stage and performs what would become their hit anthem, I Want Change. Though Victor Tsoi maintains that the song wasn't meant to be political, it couldn't have been more perfect for the moment. Kino would quickly become the most popular punk band in the late Soviet Union. And it's no surprise that they're also the hardest to define. At times I hear traces of Joy Division or the Smiths, but ultimately there really isn't a comparable Western band. They're both completely their own thing and quintessential Soviet.
People know that Kino, Victor Tsoi, the guys with the truth.
As the decade wore on, Kino would play across the Eastern Bloc, even to countries like Denmark and France, and then eventually the United States. The Soviet Union was truly opening their borders for the first time, and this not only gave bands the chance to play abroad, it also allowed Western record labels and producers to come in.
What we have to keep in mind here is that the Russian connection is going to be the first thing that everybody's going to grab onto.
America's major record labels wanted to capitalize on the suddenly available talent, and the first big push went to Boris Grebenshchikov, frontman of Aquarium. As an attractive, thoughtful, and catchy songwriter who also happened to speak fluent English, he was the full package. The documentary The Long Way Home covers Boris's signing to CBS Records, capturing the very soul-sucking meeting where Boris unknowingly enters the meat grinder of American pop.
I'd like the package to, without being heavy-handed, tell that story. The marriage of two cultures. I think there's a lot of material on it that can work in the United States.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, making his American television debut, please welcome Boris Grebenshchikov.
The record did actually produce a pretty catchy single, but I think that's more a testament to Boris's brilliant songwriting than the six-figure recording budget or the army of producers that flavored his sound.
Dang, so he was the first. He was experimental, you know. Poor guy.
In the end, it was a flop, and Boris returned to Russia just a year later. Back in Europe, the year 1989 would see the fall of the Berlin Wall. Spooky Moo would release a self-titled record produced by Brian Eno, and Kino would release their album, The Star Called Sun. On it is perhaps their most famous and one of their darkest songs, Pack of Cigarettes.
Oh, me and Mario reacted to this.
The lyrics are
Coming
full of
soon.
idioms that unfortunately don't translate smoothly, but I'm going to link to
That's
a
true.
video that does a good job, because I think they're extremely compelling. Kino had survived some dark times, including years of uncertainty as to whether they could ever live as musicians or even play another show. By the late 80s, against all odds, they're experiencing stardom. So why is this the gloomiest song I've ever heard? I think this gives us a little glimpse into the conflicts of perestroika. Yes, there's economic hope, there's McDonald's for the first time, but so much of the country is still living in crumbling Khrushchevkas. The system you were taught to believe in since grammar school was being exposed as a fraud. The familiar places and routines you maybe even unknowingly relied on were disappearing. I'm not saying this is exactly what Victor Tsoi was thinking. He always claimed his lyrics were more personal than political.
True.
But what's clear is that he captures a moment where reality is so faint, the only constant you can rely on is the drag of a cigarette. A year later, Victor Tsoi would be dead. A car crash in Latvia. Tsoi was driving alone when he fell asleep at the wheel. Kino had become
R.I.P.,
such
man.
massive figures during Perestroika.
Rest in peace,
his
my
death
guy.
was widely mourned by music fans and artists
in
across
peace.
the Eastern Bloc. To this day, the Soy Wall in Moscow is a place where fans come to leave a broken cigarette or spray a message on the wall.
I have to go there. I got to check it out.
By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union would formally collapse, becoming the Russian Federation and patchwork of post-Soviet republics that it is today. The 90s would bring its own challenges: recessions, corruption, Boris Yeltsin. I imagine for bands like Aquarium, there had to be some nostalgia for the days of the rock club, when knowing who your enemy was obvious, when all the freaks and weirdos could gather together in one building. I doubt anyone would want to go back to that time, but I imagine it was, in retrospect, simpler. Vova Blue and the Brothers of the Mind, the band that started off this video, broke up in 1993, though its members have continued to release music on their own. Mike Nemenko passed away in 1991 from head trauma, possibly received during a robbery, and Igor Latov, who continued playing music for many years, died of heart failure in 2008. Aquarium and Spooky Moo have continued to play in various lineups to the present day. And Artemy Troitsky, the writer and concert promoter who was responsible for enabling so much of the rock scene, continues to be an outspoken journalist, though he's since relocated to Estonia because, well, for better or worse, the time since the fall of the Soviet Union has been anything but boring. Whether that has yielded some unique musical movements is a topic for another video, or perhaps worthy of a comment below. As always, thanks for watching, and if you...
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, you know. I don't really know much about the artist or the era or what was going on at the time, so this is actually interesting. If you guys have any suggestions or any documentaries that are subtitled of this sort of catalog, or in English, let me know. Was he right with what he said? Was the information valid? But yeah, 50 likes for more of this content, guys. You already know what it is. Patreon link in the description. Like, comment, subscribe. On to the next. Peace.